right, well, I'm going to bring this back to kind of a micro level from all the macro level conversations we were having this morning. I hope everybody left the geopolitical panel feeling maybe a little scared, but I think we have an opportunity to make real constructive change at micro levels while addressing a lot of those global issues. It's my pleasure to be here today on Treaty 7 territory and to be welcomed to this territory. I usually reside in Treaty 6 territory in what we call Edmonton and as part of the Métis homeland. I am a settler. I am a first-generation Canadian. I am of German descent. And it's really my privilege to be able to take on the role as the inaugural CEO of the Métis Settlements Development Corporation. We are the first investment management firm for the Métis settlements of Alberta, and we are dedicated to building economic prosperity for the next 7 generations of Métis settlement members. Now, who are the Métis settlements? Who here knows who the Métis settlements are? Kyle, do not put up your hand. Okay, Métis settlements in Alberta are actually the only land-based Métis in all of Canada. They are Alberta's second largest landholder with 1.25 million acres of land across 8 settlements, all in northern Alberta, in the west and in the east. We have about 6,500 citizens across those 8 municipalities. So very, very unique construct in Canada as far as Métis people go, and only here in Alberta. So we're incredibly fortunate for that. What I wanted to talk about today was Indigenous involvement in major projects and energy transition. We know that Indigenous people can help us solve our biggest climate issues and the challenges that we have. Traditional ways of knowing have allowed us, there we go, traditional ways of knowing can come to bear and make real differences in the problems that we're trying to solve. So, how do we do this? It's really our duty to understand the incredible history and relationship that Indigenous people have with Turtle Island, this place we call North America. We need to learn and understand our shared history, and hopefully yesterday many of you participated in Truth and Reconciliation Days. Got slides, they're terrible slides. I'm not even gonna change them, don't worry about it. So I hope people participated yesterday in many of the events around Truth and Reconciliation, but this is something we need to do every single day. We can't just be doing this on one day of the year. And we do that by sharing our common history and our understanding. And the way we can do that is by partnership, relationship, and involvement. We can create that shared understanding. And so one of the fundamentals that I always like to base things on is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Say that 20 times really fast. And the biggest concept within that is free, prior, and informed consent. And I really will be focusing on free, prior, and informed consent today. So how many people here are familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Action number 92? Show of hands. It's really bright up here. Okay, a few of you. Well, the call to action number 92 is really essential if you're doing business in Canada today, and I encourage you all to go read the 94 calls to action because they're incredibly important into moving what we need to do forward and acknowledging the past and righting those wrongs. So number 92, if you're in corporate Canada, it calls on you to adopt the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, reconciliation framework, including meaningful consultation and respectful relationships based in free, prior, and informed consent before proceeding with projects. Creating equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And then educating ourselves, our management, and our staffs on the history of Indigenous people, the history and legacy of residential schools, UNDRIP, treaties, Indigenous rights, and much more. That's fundamental to what we need to be doing in corporate Canada. Marcia Turner has a TEDx talk where she talks about Indigenous wisdom for meaningful change. And if you've never seen Marcia Turner talk, I highly encourage you to do so. And she talks about moving away from approaches that are checkboxes, token, and superficial, and away from performative allyship to genuine relationships and real action. So when you're considering bringing Indigenous knowledge and values into your business, it can change your projects. Right now and today, we know that we need to have Indigenous people at the table when we're conceptualizing projects. It's part of what we do at MSDC, the Métis Settlement Development Corporation, is come to the table early and have these conversations. When UNDRIP was adopted by Canada in 2021, they really consulted a lot of Indigenous people. And the primary part of that was understanding how do we build in free, prior, and informed consent. And that needed to go on beyond traditional consultation, beyond royalty payments and shared benefit agreements, but that understanding that no matter where your project is going to be, you're on Indigenous territory of some type, and that you have to build those long and transformative relationships. Sorry, my notes, I'm reading. The Conference Board of Canada did a study about strengthening the economic opportunity for Indigenous people. And really, they said some really interesting things. So I'm going to quote a couple things. Canadian lawmakers and corporations have a history of undermining Indigenous self-determination and enabling major projects with destructive impacts. Indigenous ownership of major projects is an opportunity to gain experience from these mistakes and build better projects together. We no longer can undermine Indigenous territories and lands with the building of our projects. We need to bring people there. Those revenues that Indigenous people get from equity projects and equity participation in those projects help advance self-determination, build infrastructure, create economic and social benefits, create educational opportunities, which is what we all want. We also noted that in that report that Indigenous built community-owned businesses are actually succeeding at a large scale, and they're empowering self-determination. We've got a few examples in this room, probably, of great Indigenous businesses that are building at large scale. But there's still a long, long way to go. So let's talk some statistics. Now I really have to read. All right. So more Indigenous people live in poverty in Canada than the average Canadian, 19.4% compared to 10.7% of the general population. Household incomes are traditionally lower than the general Canadian population at $39,000 per household compared to $50,000. That's a 23% income gap. There are currently 19,000 businesses located in Indigenous communities across Canada, according to the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, on whose board I'm proud to serve. That's about $10 billion in total revenue, but only represents about 1.3% of the businesses in Canada. However, 5% of the population in Canada currently self-identifies as Indigenous, and they have grown 42% in the last 10 years. The fastest growing population in Canada is our Indigenous population. In fact, Indigenous entrepreneurs are growing at 9 times the rate of the general Canadian population. And the total value of the Indigenous economy in Canada is about $50 billion. That's still only 1.7% of total GDP. There was an ATB report that came out in 2021. They just did an update, actually just released last week, which was really great and coincidental because I was quoting the report in my speech. And we know that by closing the income gap for Indigenous people in Alberta, we could create another $3 billion in spending annually, 14,000 new jobs, and generate an additional $600 million of tax revenue. So if you have a product or a technology or a project or something, imagine the impact you can make if you involved Indigenous people in that. But what's the biggest challenge? Well, access to capital is probably one of the biggest challenges we've seen. Sources of capital in Indigenous-led enterprises is very significant and challenging. Funding continues to come from government, usually in the form of grants. And with investors, there's often a wide gulf of cultural understanding and uncertainty that goes with Indigenous-led investment opportunities. The banking sector still uses traditional means of finance. About 5 years ago, I worked for an organization where we had an Indigenous entrepreneurship program. Biggest challenge for all Indigenous entrepreneurs is getting financing. And those traditional means of collateral and finance create artificial barriers for Indigenous people. There's been some discussions about how we have to evolve those colonial structures and place higher values on relationship, communities, and social capital. We still have a long way to break things down. We just launched our Métis Settlements Impact Fund, where we're actually raising private and institutional capital to support the Indigenous economy, but it's a massive education curve. We still hear things, and the Conference Board study actually quoted an investor as saying, "It's an unfortunate fact of life that failures in Indigenous business tend to reinforce negative stereotypes and their capacity to build and manage successful businesses." But that's not true. According to the First Nations Bank of Canada, which is the only Indigenous-owned chartered bank in Canada, default rates amongst Indigenous businesses are the lowest in the country. In fact, in their entire history, they've had one loan default in 30 years, and they only loan to Indigenous businesses. So it's very significant. Another misconception is that Indigenous communities are awash with cash, which is also not true. Governments often control the income Indigenous communities generate and how that income can be allocated within their communities and how they can invest it. And of the 630 First Nations in Canada, there's only a few dozen that have built own source incomes in a really substantial way. So, of the 470 natural resource projects in Canada, worth about $528 billion, there could be about a $50 billion equity opportunity for Indigenous communities if Indigenous people are invited to the table to participate. Somebody you'll be hearing from later in this room, Shanna Martineau of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, always says that no major project in Canada can be built without Indigenous equity participation. And I couldn't agree with her more. This equity participation is absolutely critical to project success. And if industry doesn't start thinking about that, we're not going to see major successes happen. We're going to continue to see legal actions and project delays. We've actually seen it in Alberta in the last few weeks. Indigenous blockades on resource projects on their lands where no free, prior, and informed consent has taken place, and the potential legal actions that might be taken for lack of consultation and environmental assessments. But how about a really good example? Has anybody heard of the Hydro One, Ontario's Hydro One expansion? So they have to expand their entire electrical grid in Ontario? Yeah. So in 2022, they announced probably the most leading industry equity partnership for Indigenous people that there can be. They are giving Indigenous communities a 50% equity stake in all new future large-scale capital transmission lines worth over $100 million. But they're not doing it at the beginning and asking for capital. They're doing the buy-in at the end. So as the electrical infrastructure starts being built and generating wealth, Indigenous communities get the wealth and they get their buy-in stake. It's groundbreaking. It's ingenious. It manages free, prior, and informed consent, and it brings Indigenous people to the table at the beginning of the projects, and the impacts are understood, guaranteeing more success. So today we are at an economic crossroads in Canada. We know that reconciliation creates an opportunity for a whole new generation of corporate thinking and policy building, and that we can be better in sustainability, climate, and change when we bring Indigenous people to the table. We know this, we need to do this in order to reach our net zero goals. We all need to participate. So how do we do some of that? Well, there has been some advice given by some very learned people that I will now turn to. So number one, embrace free, prior, and informed consent. Create enhanced collaboration. Consider Indigenous-led environmental impacts in all of your energy projects. Ensure that Indigenous consent is fundamental to your decision making. Develop shared leading practices with engagement from Indigenous communities that harness traditional knowledge sharing and relationship building. View equity participation as a critical component of success, and then invest in financial tools and skills for Indigenous communities and build capacity. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy actually has 4 pillars, and within their finance pillar, they give 25 calls to action of how corporate Canada and government needs to be involving in order to move Indigenous economy further. They talk about co-developing policies and projects, cross-cultural opportunities, ESG, Indigenous initiatives, and inclusive goals, which is something we practice at the Métis Settlements Development Corporation. We have a complete set of ESG, Indigenous goals and metrics that we utilize when we assess investment opportunities. Equity participation and co-development, building employment and procurement opportunities, listening to Indigenous voices and bringing them to the table, and yet again, always considering pre-fire and informed consent. So, you can tell I'm excited and enthusiastic about this subject as I stand here, because my learning journey is far from over. I've been involved with Indigenous communities and doing work like this for the last 5 years. And it's the incredible people I work with, friends, colleagues, partners, many of them in this room, that I get to learn from. I've learned what it means to be an ally and that I need to be part of the change. In fact, I was called an accomplice a few months ago at a Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business event, and actually wrote a blog post on it on LinkedIn. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, you can read it. It was really interesting because it was like when you go beyond being just a passive ally to being a vocal proponent, you're now an accomplice. And I thought that that was really meaningful to me. Is making a difference. So I advocate for you guys, if you have a project, a technology, something that's going to benefit the world, figure out how to partner with an Indigenous community, an Indigenous entrepreneur, an Indigenous organization like ours, and create benefit beyond just that technology or that project. You'll benefit, your company will benefit, your project will benefit, and we can all break down the systemic barriers that face Indigenous people and hold them back from being full participants in the economy. Do a selfless plug, of course. Think about partnering with MSDC. We're doing a lot of great work. We work in energy transition and agriculture and health and look at all sorts of different ways to start impacting Indigenous communities through our investments. But more than that, I encourage you to look at how to build your reconciliation journey. So with that, I close. I thank you all for listening to me today, and I guess we're opening it up to questions. So I think Erin's joining me again.
Thank you, Barbara. Let's have a chair by this fire.
Yeah,
and,
a chair by the
make
fire.
It feel real here. Thank you so much for those comments. That was amazing. I love all of the advice. I maybe referenced that I felt like I was a little bit advanced on my truth and reconciliation journey, which I am not, but I feel like I'm well underway with the truth. It's the reconciliation part that is often where people, I think, like myself, feel a little bit nervous entering into or unknowing the how to do that work. So thank you for the advice. I think some of my key takeaways just from that, before we go to you, are about building those long-term relationships, how much that matters, knowing UNDRIPs and the calls to action, the benefits of partnering, obviously they're multiple with Indigenous communities, and then the challenges are super interesting, and the concept of sort of traditional finance and traditional mechanisms probably aren't all fit for purpose when we're looking to partner with Indigenous communities. So I guess on the finance side, I will start with a question, and then I will invite the audience to offer questions too, knowing that you're one human who might not have all the answers to every question, but I think just the willingness and the openness to invite questions is what we're trying to do here, even though the space can, it's charged, it's emotional. The trust that Peter and some of the other speakers on stage this morning were referring to is definitely not there wholly with our Indigenous community members. So I want to tell you that we trust you to ask some good questions, and you will be okay in asking those questions. But the first one I'd like to hear a little bit more from you on, Barbara, is how can we sort of incite more institutional and private investment into these projects, given there is a challenge with sort of traditional finance mechanisms? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, and I mean, we have seen some really great advances. So, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation was stood up 5 years ago to create a loan guarantee program to support more Indigenous equity in different industry-led projects. A lot of those are brownfields. A lot of pipelines have been funded. But it has opened the pathway for equity by just providing that loan guarantee. And what we're seeing is that more of industry is actually working with that and taking advantage of that. What we need to be doing is pressing more financial institutions and more institutional and private investors to look at economic reconciliation and the pathways that are being provided as key investment opportunities with solid returns. It's one of the reasons we actually created the impact fund that we developed, is because lack of capital was a real issue for us in making investments, and we wanted to start bringing and building a bridge and a pathway to bring more institutional investors into the economic reconciliation journey. And hopefully there'll be a lot more communities that kind of take that path, and we can build that education level. But we really need to start decolonizing the financial system, because it's really specifically geared. If you ever want to hear me go off on my whole venture capital tangent, that 99% of venture capital goes to white men. Only about 1 and a bit percent goes to anybody of any diversity. That includes women, Indigenous people, people of color. That's a real problem in our system, is that we're not dispersing capital. We need to start thinking of these things differently, and we need to bring different and new leaders to the table to start having those conversations and making that journey. So we have Raven Capital, Longhouse, Hungerford, us. There's people doing things to make changes, but it's going to take time, and we need that allyship to start lifting those voices.
Thank you for that. Okay, I do, because I've said it several times, want to flip to the audience now. There is a microphone over here, but anyone who has a question that they'd like to pose to Barbara can raise their hand. Great, right in the middle. Janelle, or coming from the other side.
I am not the expert by any means.
But you have insights and perspective.
This is the beginning of my journey.
Thank you again for your presentation. One question I have is, there's a lot of heritage infrastructure projects that already exist in Canada that do have an impact on the environment and do have an impact on the communities that they go through, which didn't have consultation. Maybe they were done in the 50s or the 40s and definitely did not have ownership. Has there been any discussion about revisiting some of these heritage projects and maybe revisiting safety, revisiting environmental commitments, rebuilding engagement with Métis and First Nations communities to ensure that these projects are a benefit to everyone involved?
So there's a couple of things. So there's the First Nations Major Projects Coalition that looks at new projects and all projects kind of related to First Nations. So they do a lot of work in that environmental consultation. What we're seeing is some of those legacy things, like pipelines, are now bringing in Indigenous equity. We can't go back and kind of solve some of those problems, right? I mean, there's still a lot of issues and a lot of problems, and we see them happen. But building some of that equity into those, like the Enbridge pipeline deal that was done about 3 years ago, which involved 23 Métis communities and First Nations here in Alberta, where they got an equity stake in the Enbridge pipelines in Alberta. you know, that's making a difference for the communities, but it's also giving them voices at the table, right? So Enbridge has an Indigenous Advisory Council. We want to continue that flow. There's a long way to go, and sometimes we take steps back. Like we saw CP Rail actually dissolve its Indigenous Advisory Council. Well, they didn't dissolve it. The entire Indigenous Advisory Council stepped down because they weren't moving forward enough. So there's a long way to go, which is why we all need to kind of step up on those things. It's hard to go back with those legacy projects. What we can do is look forward and see how more of that equity and that transaction and ownership can be brought. There's still a lot of legacy stuff in the Indian Act, which I don't even understand. You know, read 21 things you don't know about the Indian Act. And a lot of like the challenges that exist, especially for First Nations, are due to that piece of legislation. So there's a lot of ways we can't make change because it's still so restrictive.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, we do have time for one more. If anyone else would like to pose one question.
So none of my plans.
Oh, there is one more. Okay. Like otherwise, right in the middle again. Thank you.
I'm just curious about access to capital. It's challenging, of course, and I just wonder what kind of work has been done to bring in like credit unions and those sort of things into these projects where they don't have a single mandate just for profit. They also have a mandate to serve a community in an area. And it seems like that system could maybe solve some of those challenges around, you know, what does and doesn't get financed, because at the end of the day, they're operating with kind of a larger mandate. I don't know if different development corporations have tried to incorporate them more or involve them, or if you've had any success with that. Thanks.
I think we talk to all the financial institutions, whether that's chartered banks, credit unions, ATB, obviously First Nations Bank, are all really important. I think the biggest challenge in access to capital will be credit and credit risk, right? And as long as we're tied to those colonial structures of how credit is assessed and viability is assessed, that'll continue to be a problem. You know, Paul Lecrete from Raven Capital, I was at a presentation he gave, and we talked a lot about how we need to break down those barriers and start looking at like community and relationship and social capital to change the way that the financial system assesses people's creditworthiness. So it's not necessarily the institutions, it's those premises around how credit and risk is assessed that needs to shift.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions, both of you. I think a key takeaway for me really is like do things differently and do things together. Like we need to figure out how to do this in a way in partnership that benefits more people in these projects going forward. So thank you so much for those comments. I am told before we give a round of applause to Barbara to tell you a few things about lunch. So bear with me. Food for purchase will be available at the gallery outside of this room or downstairs. Food trucks are outside in lot 3, and the bar in the Exchange is open as of now until 6. So my understanding is we are breaking for lunch, and then the program starts maybe in an hour. So thank you for your attendance and for listening to our keynote. Barbara McKenzie, join me in thanking her very much.
Thanks, everyone.